Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet. This is my post-season reaction to Alfa Romeo and how well they stacked up. How well did they stack up against my preseason predictions? How well did they stack up to my in-season ratings? And how well did the drivers stack up against the other drivers around them? So we will see here in this nice little table that Alfa Romeo, of course, officially ended the season in 9th position. Where did I have them in my preseason predictions? I have them ranked as 6th, so quite a bit off on that prediction. And of course, in my end of my regular season rating, ended up in 10th. Now, how did I find my rating for the season? I basically took each driver for the team and rated them 1 through 10 for each race throughout this season or weekend for this season. And based on those results, I averaged them in, and so I got a score of 5.57 for Alfa Romeo. Now, that put them in the 10th position overall. So not quite as good as where they ended up, and they ended up actually behind Haas in my ratings that I came up with. But officially, of course, they came in 9th. But of course, neither of those were anywhere close to my preseason predictions of 6th. So quite a bit off on that front. I was thinking that Alfa Romeo had a good start of the season in that preseason testing. I thought they were going to look good, and I figured they were going to be able to keep up with that ranking throughout the season, continue to do development on that Alfa Romeo, and at least keep steady in those positions for the vehicles around them, which was not the case. They kind of dropped off quite significantly throughout this season. In fact, as my ratings predicted here, they basically ended up being the last of the constructors in my rating, and I think that's kind of deserved, as they haven't really developed that car and wasn't able to maintain that car in any kind of form throughout the season, in my view. Now, we had a couple of drivers get some points that helped them out throughout the season, but overall, I think they were the slowest car for this season. Now, so we have Jon Carpenter, whose official standing was 18th, and I had them predicted at 15th, so dropped down quite a few positions from my preseason prediction. And then in my in-season prediction, I gave him a 19, so actually he was officially better than my regular season rating. And my regular season rating had a average score of 5.39. So a little bit above average, but not that great for Jon Carpenter. I think this is mainly because he's not able to really get 100% extra out of that Alfa Romeo. And so he struggles sometimes in that vehicle, getting the most out of that vehicle, unlike his teammate, which has some glimpses of where he can actually pull that Alfa Romeo up into the point standings and get a little bit better, even though he has some very bottom of the barrel runs as well. So speaking of Valtteri Bottas, his standing was officially 15th. I had my preseason way up in 8th, so quite a bit off on that front as well. And then my in-season prediction was 18th, so both of those were off. So he actually did much better in my preseason and official standards than I gave him on my record of 5.75 average score for all of his races. So as you can see here, I was thinking that Alfa Romeo and each driver was going to do much better than they actually did overall in this front, and that caused them to drop back into the back of the pack as they could not keep up with the rest of the other teams throughout the development phase throughout the season, keeping them in contention with the drivers and vehicles around them. So we will look at the two teammates and how well they compared against each other here. And this is a graph of where they ended up for each race at the end of each race. So we have the 20th position, which is bad, all the way up to 0, which is, cannot be achieved, but that first position there. So basically the lower on this graph, the better the driver did for that race and overall. So you have to look at that in that context. And of course, you look at that number 10 right there in the middle, where that's the point barrier for the official standings. So anything below that is good and gets actually official points. Anything above that really doesn't count unless you're tied for points in that regard on the official standing side. But if you look at here and kind of figure out where they compared against each other, you can kind of see the same pattern for the most part. You kind of have to take some of the top peaks out, as that's usually when something wrong had happened, like a collision or something else that caused them to drop back into the back of the grid or out of the standing altogether. So you have quite a bit of those, which is not good for the team overall, but in general for the drivers, it's harder to judge some of that, but I have them included here just for visual sake in this regard. But you can kind of see, each team member here actually followed roughly the same pattern, even though they had a couple of outsets for each of those in that regard. So you can kind of get the feel for the Alfa Romeo as a team as a whole, how well their vehicle did throughout this season. And you can kind of see here, they started off decently, gaining a couple of points for both Valtteri and Jon Carpenter, and then had a mid-season kind of issue where they dropped back and then they had a nice little spike where they gained a couple of points in Qatar for both drivers, and then they basically fell off for the last several races. Now, both of these lines are basically looking kind of worse, even though Valtteri's looks much worse than Jon Carpenter's. Jon Carpenter is pretty much steady across the board in that running. As you can see, Valtteri seems to be more peaky, as he kind of does really good or really bad in that front, which kind of causes him to veer off near the end because he's not quite getting in his car where he needs to be and getting into some trouble there. So yeah, Valtteri's going to get worse throughout the season. Started off strong and kind of slowly got worse throughout the season, where Jon Carpenter is pretty much a steady line across the board throughout the season, which is good for him because that means he could probably, on the long haul, take more advantage of the situation. So if they have a good car, he'll be apt to do overall better in those positions. But in some of those, risk gains you the reward, and that's what we kind of see from Valtteri Bottas in this run. So, how did the other drivers compare to the people around them? We will start off with Jon Carpenter, who is in 18th position, just ahead of Kevin Magnussen in 19th, and just behind Daniel Ricciardo in 17th. Now, of course, Daniel didn't have a full season, and he actually broke his hand in part of that season, so we have these nice gaps in this running. So you can look at his trend line that looks like it's getting worse, whereas the other ones are kind of getting better. Or actually, opposite way, sorry. His is looking like it's getting really better, where other ones are getting worse in this run because you have to flip the graph upside down to look at those lines because of the positioning markers in this run. But it's hard to really say how well Daniel Ricciardo would have done over the full season. As you can see, he started off not so great and then kind of worked his way up a couple of times. And so kind of inconsistent view right now of Daniel Ricciardo, but compared to Jon Carpenter, I think Jon Carpenter definitely has a much steadier line, even though his are, getting worse slightly across the season. I think that's mainly because of the vehicle, not necessarily because of his driving. If they could keep up that development a little bit more on that Alfa Romeo, I think he would have done better. I think he did a good job of developing, slowly getting the more out of that vehicle, the more the season goes on, but to maintain that steady pace, unlike Kevin, who kind of got worse throughout the season at a higher rate than Juan Zhou did. But I thought this was kind of interesting in regard to those drivers to kind of figure out what parts of the season one did better over the other, and kind of how up and down their season was in regard to each other. Now, how did Valtteri do? We can see here, Valtteri in red, and Nico Hülkenberg in 16th in blue, just behind him, and Yuki Tsunoda in yellow, just ahead of him in the official standings. So what do we see here is that Valtteri, as I said, having that slightly decrease throughout the season, taking more chances and kind of losing out near the end of the race, trying to really push that Alfa Romeo, and where it really didn't have a chance to be because of the development work, I think, in my view. But really kind of struggling throughout the season as the season went on, kind of getting worse, where we see basically Yuki Tsunoda having a nice steady line for the most part, as well as Nico Hülkenberg having that slightly steady line, but kind of getting worse as well. But just overall, where they ended up on that graph, you can kind of tell they're roughly in the same pack, same kind of skill, I think, due to those vehicles roughly kind of getting the most out of those not quite high performing vehicles as the rest of the pack is. But you can kind of see that due to the teams and how they aligned, you can kind of figure out where they resided overall the season. Yuki did fairly well at the very beginning, where they kind of dropped off in the midseason and started coming back a little bit more in the end season, even though he had some peaks that kind of messes up his season overall, dropping out due to some issues. As I said, you kind of take those in that line and just kind of compare each other and how well they did. So you have a lot of peakiness for all three drivers, but overall you can kind of see where they line up to each other. So how well did the teams end up together? And we have, of course, the three teams and where they got their points. And you can, of course, see Alpha Tauri gaining most of their points at the end of the season, where they came back with that nice update that worked out for them. So the last several races, they were able to get some decent points, whereas Alfa Romeo just had that one session in Qatar where they gained a bunch of points, and overall they were kind of dropping off on the point scale. So I think they kind of got lucky in Qatar, which kind of helped them boost and get them into that 9th position. Whereas they weren't able to make the improvements that AlphaTauri did to really improve at the end of the season. And the beginning of the season, they did better than AlphaTauri, so they did a better off-season development to start the season off. So it kind of was the opposite of AlphaTauri in that regard, except it worked out worse for Alfa Romeo than it did for AlphaTauri, as they were able to gain more points at the end of the season than Alfa Romeo did at the beginning of the season. So it kind of flip-flopped that regard, but this is a nice graph that kind of shows you the true trend lines for each team during the season. So we have Haas and Alfa Romeo dropping off on their performance throughout the season, where AlphaTauri was actually increasing their performance trend throughout this season. And so we look at the step graph and kind of figure out really how well this predicted throughout the season. Because you can kind of see, as I kind of talked about in my last video, of how Haas and Alfa Romeo were kind of trading positions, and Alfa Romeo was able to get those extra points in Qatar that bumped them up ahead of Haas. Here you can kind of see that AlphaTauri was at the very back, so they weren't really paying attention to AlphaTauri. And then, of course, those last 5 races, AlphaTauri was able to get that update and really take advantage of those updates to get the points and jump ahead of both Haas and Alfa Romeo. So in that regard, how well did Alfa Romeo do throughout the season? Again, I think they started off decently. As you can see here, of course, they started off with points, which is always good. And then we're kind of steadily gaining a couple of points here and there throughout this season, and able to manage to actually outperform Haas in that regard. And I think they were thinking they were going to be locked in that 8th position or higher until AlphaTauri came out with a better improvement, which made them jump pretty far up in this field. So on that point range, it makes it hard to estimate what they can do. I mean, basically, they really need to do better development. I think Alfa Romeo probably had the slowest car this season as a whole, even though they started off strong. I don't think they were able to develop that car quite as well. And I think Haas had a few more issues, and their drivers weren't quite as caliber, I guess, to get the most out of the points in those races where they kind of could take advantage of some chaos. So I think in that regard, I think Alfa Romeo has a lot of work to do, and it's kind of hard to figure out where they're going to end up this next season, especially with them kind of tailoring off their support in the F1 circuit season. So that is kind of my thoughts and pattern and review reaction for Alfa Romeo. What is next? We come up with AlphaTauri and their 4 drivers instead of the 2. As we kind of went through this season, they kind of had some chaos in that driver lineup. So we'll see a little bit more grass because we have 4 drivers instead of 2. But if you made it this far, I'd appreciate a like. And if you want to see my AlphaTauri stack up review/reaction, I'd appreciate a subscribe. Until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.